great to be here, and Isha, you're a very brave person to get me over here to cause some trouble. Yeah, I'm an artist, and I was thinking about what's the best way to frame this talk. So let's play a game. Let's imagine that I'm coming from a parallel universe, a universe where people can engage in other pursuits besides seeking profits and solutions. A universe where people can actually look for trouble and make a living out of it. This is the universe where I exist from. So imagine me to be some kind of an artist Rick, for those of you who follow Rick and Morty, who would give you some hard time now, and maybe this imagination would make this next half an hour less painful for all of us. So Yuval Noah Harari talks about the idea that our current systems are basically broken. Yeah? So all of our institutions are based on 19th century idea of the Industrial Revolution, and something is going to give very, very soon, especially in the light of the new knowledge we get in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. We live in a time where our technology is becoming more lifelike, at the very same time that life is becoming more technology-like. And thank you, Ben, for kind of putting it into the context. I think it worked really well. But in my universe, a universe of what I call contestable design, where I look for symptoms when other people provide solutions. So I try to see what symptoms those solutions are for. You can also look at it as a form of a psychopathology that we are all experiencing. As we are losing control over our technologies, as we are losing control over human-made systems, our economies, our political systems, and our technologies, we relinquish this control willingly. We need to feel that we're trying to control other systems that existed outside of our control. And this is the synthetic biology revolution. This is the cellular agriculture revolution. This is our psychopathology of trying to control things that existed outside of our own control. And I would argue as well that any attempt to assert one's control over systems that existed outside of that control is by definition an act of violence. Yeah? So what we're engaging with in those 2 days is degrees of violence. And this is a good exercise in my universe to avoid self-righteousness. So obviously we are kind of coming a full circle. Yeah, this is an image of the meatpacking industry here in America in the 19th century. And the story goes that Henry Ford actually went to see those disassembly lines where complex biological systems were broken apart to abstracted kind of products in order for him to come up with the assembly line. And now we're kind of coming a full circle where we are trying to use the same logic to try and rebuild living biological systems using the same kind of mindset that Henry Ford established then. We heard about Jack Laub. This is not a quote from him about this idea of biology becoming engineering. And I would add life is becoming a raw material for us to engineer. Now, we're all aware that all of our attempts are, in a sense, attempts to treat nature, and this is the first and last time I'm going to use this term here, as an obstacle to be overcome. So we are going to spend 2 days talking about the obstacles that we need to overcome in order to conquer this metaphysical notion of nature. But once upon a time, I lived in your world. And I wrote my design thesis about the future in which biotechnology and design might come together. It was in the mid-90s. I recognized then what is very obvious now, that as engineers are moving into biology, as biology becoming an engineering pursuit, designers would have to move in and design those living biological products. So I was very optimistic at the time. I came from an ecological design background. And as I was imagining those types of futures and those types of products that designers would have to design, I became also somewhat disillusioned because this idea of changing our culture from a culture of making to a culture of growing, changing the way we do things, which I thought might yield positive environmental outcomes, also yields another way of starting to treat life as yet another commodity in a way that kind of basically we've done before. So in a sense, we're not solving any problem. We're continuing with business as usual while we are basically using living biological systems as our new site of exploitation. So 1996, I entered the lab. So I wrote my thesis as a speculative design thesis. At the time, the term didn't exist, but also I didn't enter the lab. And in 1996, I entered the lab and started to work with tissue engineering, which was my technology of choice to look at those new futures. And I chose to do it as an artist because artists are really, really good at posing questions and shining broken mirrors back to society to reflect on where we might be going and ask those questions. And then in the year 2000, Untitled, my collaborator, and myself were invited to act as research fellows in Harvard Medical School, where we worked with one of the leading scientists in the field of tissue engineering, Dr. Joseph Vacanti. And the very first project that we decided to do in his lab, and actually ended up being the very first time that living tissue-engineered structures have been presented in a cultural context, we decided to fashion after the Guatemalan worry dolls. Now, the Guatemalan worry dolls are small dolls you give to kids before they go to bed. The kids tell the worries to the dolls, and the dolls are supposed to take the worries away. So we tissue-engineered, so we handcrafted those dolls out of surgical suture and different types of polymers. We seeded them with cells. We used McCoy cells, which are really interesting cells, because the literature tells us that they originated from a fluid of a knee of an arthritis patient, but now they're classified as mouse cells, and this is something actually for all of you tissue engineers. Just check your cells once in a while to see that they're not contaminated by other cell lines. But that's a different story. And we grown them in the gallery as a way to kind of try and get people anxieties in regard to the new future in which life is becoming a raw material and biological systems are becoming our new products. As we were doing that, we also started to work on our in-vitro meat project. So at the time in the lab, one of our colleagues, another researcher, was doing in-utero tissue engineering with lamb, and she harvested those basically satellite cells that you heard about this morning and started to culture them in the lab. And I think she was somewhat obsessive-compulsive. She couldn't throw them away. So as you heard this morning, after a few rounds of passaging those cells, basically all of the incubators in the lab were chock-a-block with those cells, and there was nothing she could do with them, so we decided to use them as food. It kind of made sense. But also, as our interest increased, we were in these questions about life, we realized that when we try to venture into questions about our relationship to other living systems, you can't get more intimate, even way more than sex, with another living system than consuming it and making it one with yourself, with your own body, with your own biological body. So it kind of made sense for us to engage in growing food without bodies. Yeah, so the idea is, what does it mean to start to grow and eat and consume another living system that never existed as a full body before? What does it make of you? Can we get the volume up, please?
At the University of Western Australia in Perth.
So this is a recreation of what we've done back in 2000. This is from a documentary from 2008.
Oron Katz works in the Biological Sciences Department. He's making some of the world's first artificial meat.
When we grow those cells, we actually tend to refer to them, we coin the term semi-living, because they're not fully alive, they're not an animal, but they are a living part of an animal sustained in an artificial environment.
This artificial meat was grown from the muscle cells of a lamb, but they could have been cells from any animal. The cells were cultured in a nutrient solution made up of blood plasma derived from cattle. The muscle cell cultures are grown in a microgravity bioreactor, which constantly rotates the meat so it grows in 3 dimensions. Without this motion, the meat would be flat, only a few cells thick. But there's another problem to overcome if the lab-grown meat is ever to mimic the real thing.
There is research which is being taken place at the moment in trying to find ways in which you can exercise those muscle cells so they would align and have a more of a muscle architecture. And there's 2 ways that can be done. One is by electrically stimulating those cells, or the second way is to try and exercise them physically, trying to build tiny exercise machines, tiny gyms for those cells to grow and become more like muscle.
Oron has brought his unique piece of engineered meat to the UK, to one of the world's great chefs. With 3 Michelin stars, Heston Blumenthal is famous for fusing science and gastronomy. This meat is so cutting edge that in Britain, It's not recognized as food, and so can't legally be eaten.
It's got a smell of raw liver to it.
I never really sniffed it, but...
I'm not allowed to eat it, so that's bad.
So I never really sniffed my meat before that. But it's kind of an interesting thing. Obviously, in that documentary from 2008, when BBC seemed to approach quite a few scientists around the world, no one was willing to show it off beside me. And as you can see, it looked like a little bit like a piece of snot rather than the kind of sexy meat that we all are getting used to see now. However, the first time we were able to eat meat was back in 2003. So obviously, in Vacanti's lab, we couldn't eat that piece of meat because it was a biomedical research lab, and there was chances of cross-contamination. So in 2003, United and myself were invited to show our work in an exhibition in France, in a city called Nantes. And we were able to basically build a fully functioning tissue engineering lab in the gallery, complete with a dining room. And if you can drop the volume, please. As far as you know, this is the first documentation of people putting into the mouth cells that were grown for the purpose of meat. We were playing on what constitutes foul food. So we knew that French people don't like the idea of eating engineered food very much, and that most other cultures don't like the idea of eating frogs very much. So we decided to tissue engineer frog steaks. And we also went to the edible frog distributor in the town and rescued 2 frogs from there. And they lived alongside the bioreactor. And for 3 months, we went every day to feed the frogs and to feed the meat. And at the very last day of the exhibition, we had this ultimate nouveau cuisine dinner. The title of the piece was Disembodied Cuisine. And we had this disembodied cuisine dinner where we invited some people to join us for the first tasting of meat with no bodies. We were able to grow about 5 grams of that meat. We used about 500 mils of fetal calf serum, and it cost us a ridiculous amount of money. And here you can see Joe Davis trying to cut the first piece of meat. Now, I was really concerned about health and safety issues, so I asked the French chef to cook it in a garlic and honey sauce, which are well-known antibacterial agents. And we ate it, or some of us, because to my delight, 3 out of the 6 people that joined us for dinner spat it out. And as an artist, this is great news because I could then collect those bits that were spat out and show them in the follow-up exhibition called The Remains of Disembodied Cuisine, where we had those bits that were spat out plus the whole documentation of the whole process. Now, to do with media attention, that was quite interesting. We thought we were going to generate some media. Unfortunately, at the very same time, your president decided to invade Iraq, so the media wasn't really interested in what we were doing. So it goes. Anyway, yeah. Then Mark, actually, and I thought I finished with this whole deal because I went to other project that was just one small part of the whole exploration in regard to our relationship to life and tissue-engineered, different types of tissue-engineered constructs that I was really interested to present within the context of art. But then I've seen that Mark Post had a press conference in Toronto where he said he's going to grow meat in the lab and he's going to get a chef to cook it for him and going to present it to the public. So I decided to invite him in 2012 to a cook-off where the secret ingredient was fetal calf serum. Yeah. At the time, obviously, there was less discussion around fetal calf serum replacement. I'm really happy to hear that there's progress in this field because as an artist who works with tissue engineering, that always hurts me to work with fetal calf serum. So yeah, whoever is willing to donate their serum replacement to me, I would love to test it and grow my sculptures without that. But anyway, I'm really happy. Mark was such a sport, and he joined us for that cook-off. He joined forces with a really amazing artist called Zach Dunfield, and they were cooking against another artist called John O'Shea and a philosopher called Monica Becker. And we had an amazing conversation. The best way to have conversation is obviously if you break bread and eat together. In this case, it was bread laced with fetal calf serum. Whatever fetal calf serum was left, we also then had fetal calf serum and vodka cocktails, which I still have the aftertaste so many years later from that. So that actually became quite successful, and I'm now running those cooking shows around the world where I get scientists and philosophers to cook against each other and discuss the future of food in different configurations. But then obviously after Mark presented his burger and other companies started to present theirs, and I really liked the whole kind of chase to be the first to do whatever. So we had the first burger, and then we had the first meatball, and then we had the first other thing and whatever. We decided to be the first again, and we decided to be the first to grow insect soup, in vitro insect soup. And actually, growing insects, as we heard before, it's a bit easier because you don't need to incubate them. So we designed this domestic bioreactor where we've grown the insect cells, Drosophila cells, which are cell suspension, so it's really easy to grow them rather than them. And we had all of this stuff in the morning. And the whole idea was to grow them in this soft bioreactor for the duration of the exhibition. At the time, that was actually last year at the Science Gallery in Dublin. And the last day of the show, we wanted to serve that combination of those Drosophila cells and the nutrient solution as a soup. We called it stir fly, and we obviously were playing on this whole idea that we have fly in our soup. But from my perspective, one of the most important things was obviously this dark cloud of nutrients that was hovering above this kind of beautifully designed bioreactor, kind of hanging up around there. And for that, we used about 2 liters of fetal calf serum, so we needed to kill 4 little calves in order to grow a tiny amount of insect cells. One of the technicians at the Science Gallery made a mistake, and the whole thing got contaminated, so we ended up having mushroom soup rather than insect soup, and we couldn't really eat it, so failures are celebrated in my world. Let me just talk about another piece of, I suppose, what now is considered to be cellular agriculture, and that's our victimless leather. So it kind of made sense after growing meat to move and grow leather. So in 2004, we did some tests, and we were able to actually grow leather-like material using different types of tissues or different cell types and substrates. But we decided to present it as a living garment inside a bioreactor. And then in 2008, we presented it at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. But unfortunately, halfway through the show, something really surprising from our perspective happened. We were working for the first time with embryonic stem cells, mouse embryonic stem cells, and they grew so fast that they sheared off the polymer structure, traveled throughout the system, created an embryonic body in the reservoir of the nutrients, but also started to block the system. So about 5 weeks into the show, Paola Antoinelli, the curator of MoMA, calls me and tells me, you know, something gone wrong, we can't really continue doing it, and we had to turn it off, and the whole discussion changed. Suddenly, New York Times said, murder in MoMA kills art. Art Asia Pacific was talking about murder in MoMA. Now, from our perspective, this is a really interesting thing, because as artists, that generated the kind of conversation that we felt we need to have. It was part of a very optimistic show called Design in the Elastic Mind that was kind of looking at those bright futures when artists and designers would join forces with technologists and scientists. And the only living piece out of the 250 works that were in this exhibition had to be killed halfway through the show and generate a conversation about our responsibilities towards life forms that we are responsible or that we are somehow involved in their creation. And I think those are the kind of conversations, at least in my universe, we need to have each time we're engaging with those types of life. We often have nice things. This is in the Mori Art Museum where an exhibition appropriately called Medicine and Art. I had a small fungal contamination there as well, and for the first days of the show, I administered medicine to my art, but to no avail. And let me just conclude with one of our most recent works, and this is kind of to do with actually the original paper around the footprint of cellular agriculture, the Oxford paper from 2007, was it, or 8? Where they were saying that we don't need incubators because the cells generate enough heat. So obviously, whoever wrote, is the person who wrote this paper here in the room? Yes, cool. Obviously, whoever wrote it is not a scientist or a biologist. That's not going to work like that. But we were saying, okay, if we are looking at other alternative systems to be able to generate heat without needing to use energy, how about starting to develop life forms that look after other life forms? So we developed a series of incubators, biological incubators, that use things like compost and beehives in order to generate the heat that we need in order to grow those cultures. So those are the compostobutter and the Hyvecodobacter, and you see, we need to work on our language, that generated enough kind of homeostatic conditions to grow cells in them. So obviously, within the hive, we've grown B cells, And within the compost, we were able to actually raise it to 40 degrees Celsius and regulate it to 37-degree incubator. Let me just conclude with, there was some conversation about a hype cycle. When I started more than 20 years ago, I was very enthusiastic and quite optimistic about our future. I went through somewhat of a peak of inflated expectations, but very quickly gone down the trough of disillusionment to where I'm now. I'm really in the valley of death. You know, I might be a grumpy old man, but this is where I am. You are here, yeah? So I don't know if you want to join me to this world of dark and evil valley of death, but just something for you to keep in mind. You know, we really need to work on that. And one of the things, as someone who's deeply concerned about science, I think we have to scale down our hyperbole rhetoric and get more realistic about it, because if you want to solve the problems in the world, because that's not my job, go be more humble. So, yeah, I'll conclude here, because I would love you to kind of hit me back now with some questions. So thank you so much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. So remember, again, I'm going to keep harping on this. Open your Slido and ask questions. One of the questions that I saw that I'm really interested in, especially with regard to what you just said, what do you find most boring about this entire industry, about cultured meat? What is the most boring part of this to you?
So much of it. No. The same rhetoric. So one thing I've done back in 2003 was to put a Google alert around in-vitro meat. And it was really interesting because at the time I could actually set my calendar on when I'm getting an alert about hearing the same story over and over again. So at the time, the gap actually became shorter and shorter, but for the first few years, it was once every 3 to 6 months, there was a story that was telling the same story about the future of in-vitro meat coming through. Obviously, then when Mark did his, I would start to get those notifications on a weekly basis and a daily basis, but many of those narratives just kept on repeating in a way that's made me, you know, acutely aware of the notion of cultural amnesia, which we're all suffering from, because we live in a time where we are just kind of seem to engage in those very fast kind of sound bites that make us also forget things really, really quickly after that. Yeah. I would recommend just go and do a historical search and look at the kind of language and the kind of descriptions that were going on for 10 or more years now.
Yeah. Okay, here's one a lot of people want to know. What does FBS taste like? If you can describe it.
All right. So here's a funny thing, is actually after finishing this project, I realized that there is a solution to the problems that we're facing. I chose to stop eating meat. So the first time I had something which was kind of meaty again was in 2012 when I drank the fetal calf serum. The aftertaste, you know, the kind of burp that you get afterwards, it's like if you, yeah, exactly. Maybe that's enough, but it's like kind of a not really well-done burger, I would say. Yeah. Oh. The stuff you get. I never really ate McDonald's, but I would imagine this is the same, a similar aftertaste.
So does anybody want to try it? Anybody, based on that description?
It's really good with vodka. Vodka kind of kills some of the...
I saw a couple of people raise their hands, so. Yeah. You know, this one's been upvoted too many times for me to ignore it. Have you considered culturing your own cells for food? Right. I don't know why 2020, but...
Funny enough, two people approached me straight after I've done the project in 2003. One was Jason Mahoney, who established New Harvest, so it was really nice to kind of have a conversation because he asked me to do something that as an artist I rarely do, and that's kind of reflect on what I've done and try to analyze, and that's how I figured out how much it cost me, how many cows had to be killed, and all of those kind of things. The second person was Ingrid Newkirk from PETA, so the president of PETA, and she came up with the same thing. Why not culture her own cells? From her perspective, the idea was to basically serve human meat to show that any type of meat is a form of cannibalism. It didn't work out, but this story of cannibalism keeps on coming up, and actually it came up also in the show in France. People were asking about it. As an artist, I must say, as I say, this meat is only a very small part of my practice. My interest is how our relationship to life in general is shifting and changing in the light of our new knowledge and the way we choose to apply this knowledge. Yeah. And what I realized very early in the game is that in order to do it in a way which kind of makes sense for me is to look at areas that we don't have ready-made responses to. So I tend to shy away from the human because we all have responses, ready-made responses when we start to engage with the question of the human. But when we engage with the question of life in a more general term, what we realize time and time again, and this is where maybe people like Ben and others can help us, we realize that the poverty of language is acute. You know, we have 59 words to describe human excrements, yeah, in the different manifestations. We have a very nuanced way to engage with that piece that comes out of us. We have only one word to describe life. I think what we need to do, and what you people need to do, is also to be aware that you need to figure out a way which is much more nuanced to describe what you're doing in the context of life. And we need to start to talk about, because life is a continuum, it's a spectrum of different types of phenomena. The scientists have specialized language around it, but we don't really have a cultural language to describe life in a way that actually makes sense. And this notion of the strangeness of actually, you know, being here, for many people would be because they're being confronted by something that they can't even put into words. Or as an artist, they don't even have a visual language to describe what they're doing.
That's incredible. And I think that very nicely answers what would have been the next question, which is, besides humility, what you think cellular agriculture scientists need more of. So we need to be able to describe what we're doing with more depth.
And we should be aware that, you know, we have to figure out other ways to think about the solution. So one thing that I find really interesting is the way it's now being pushed as if it's going to feed the masses. We heard about trying to feed refugees in Africa. I think this is a wrong take. I think people would resist you venomously for that because they would feel as if someone is trying to shove it down their throat. I think the best way to forward is to actually look at it at what it is now, a novelty, a technological novelty, and a luxury product. And actually that might then make it into an object of desire rather than something people would resist. That's my little advice for you, not that I'm trying to fix the world here.
Oron, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.